Since the UK lockdown was introduced on March the 15th, there have been almost no rebellions, no negative comments by British MPs from the party of the Prime Minister, which is the Conservative Party. Well, that appears to be changing. We spoke to Sir Graham Brady. He's one of the most senior British MPs from Boris Johnson's party, and he told us that over the past 6 months, the mood of Conservatives has changed, and that if Boris Johnson hopes to reintroduce lockdowns, he's going to have a much harder time of it this time round. Sir Graham Brady, you are chairman of the 1922 committee, which represents the Conservative backbenchers. Let's just zoom out for 1 second. I know you've got a measure in Parliament at the moment. Take us back to that March moment when the lockdowns were first announced. What was the mood of Tory backbenchers then, and how do you think it's changed since?
I think, like most people in the country, I think my colleagues were pretty apprehensive then. We were facing a new virus. Nobody knew how it would behave. There was plausible speculation that it could rapidly overwhelm intensive care capacity in the NHS. And of course the House of Commons was about to go off for an Easter recess. So it did seem reasonable at that point to grant emergency powers to ministers to be able to do what needed to be done if there were terrible pressures with which the NHS couldn't cope. And we did that, perhaps some of us with a heavier heart than others, but were prepared to accept it as a set of temporary measures.
There was almost no resistance at that point, was there? And have you noticed the mood change over time?
Well, I think the mood has changed over time, and many of us have been making the case for sensible, cautious opening since April. And certainly it was pretty obvious back then that you could allow open air markets to operate, which is something I called for then, and garden centres. These were all things that could have reduced the economic damage, kept some more people in employment, and also helps to give people who've been locked away in their houses for too long a little bit of an interest and an opportunity to go out and get some fresh air. So all of that could have been done, I think, much more quickly than it was. But increasingly, I think, as we've seen some sectors in particular, aviation is one I take a particular interest in, but I guess also the events sector is a very important one, which has been completely put out of business by the restrictions that are in place. So I think as that has become apparent, that so many of these sectors of the economy have been shut down for a very long period of time, sometimes with very little light at the end of the tunnel either. I think more and more of my colleagues are spending their time in their constituencies talking to constituents who are losing their jobs, losing their livelihoods, people who have built up businesses over many years and are seeing them failing. And I think that is changing the mood. People are recognising that there is a balance to be struck here. And we all want to encourage the safest approach in terms of hand hygiene and social distancing, all of those things. Most people, I think, have shown they're quite willing to do their bit, but it's got to be balanced with the recognition there are other downsides if you overdo the restrictions.
I mean, would it be fair to say it's no longer a sort of fringe position to be somewhat sceptical?
I think it would be fair to say that most of my colleagues recognise that there is a balance to be found, and that it isn't really plausible to say we will do everything that can possibly be done to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic and disregard everything else. So I think the more people understand the projections of horrifically high numbers of deaths that might happen as a result of cancers that have gone undiagnosed and untreated for far too long. I've seen projections of 30,000 deaths from that cause. People who should have had medical treatment following a cardiac arrest and haven't. These are problems being stored up for the future. And if you add to that the social costs and the economic costs that are accumulating, I think a growing number of people recognise we can't assume that there will be a miraculous vaccine that's 100% effective that will come into play in the new year. We have to work on the premise that we might have to live with coronavirus in this form for a very long time to come. And we can all hope that it might mutate to something less pernicious. We can all hope that it might burn out of its own accord. But in the meantime, we've got to make sure people can live their lives, both their normal social and family interactions, and they can get on with earning a living, being able to pay their mortgages.
How important do you feel like Sweden has been? I mean, is that something you hear mentioned a lot with colleagues as a sort of counter-example?
And I think people have been interested in the Swedish response for a long time, but going back to May, June, it was still possible for people to say, well, wait and see, it might all go horribly wrong. I guess where we are now, it is possible to see that the Swedish approach appears to have resulted in a picture where the infection rate was much higher than here in June and July, and is now falling quite rapidly, whereas in the countries that did have hard lockdowns like the United Kingdom, we've now got rates of infection that seem to be rising quite strongly. So I don't think many people now are dismissing the Swedish evidence in the way that perhaps a number of people thought they could earlier in the year.
What do you think the sort of turning point was, looking back over this period? I mean, do you think of there being a particular moment where it became more mainstream to think about alternative courses of action?
Well, I think probably the tipping point came when it was at first apparent that rather than having made those enormous sacrifices that people did make in March, April, May, and into June, and having seen that all pay off as we had hoped that it would, and that people were in a steadily improving situation where restrictions could be gradually peeled away, and the COVID-19 was going to be in retreat. Once it becomes apparent, as it I guess did in the summer, that there were going to be some new restrictions being introduced, and whether that be the quarantine arrangements or the fact that some countries were taken out of the air travel corridors, or the rule of six when that came in, some of the local restrictions that have been applied in an increasingly large area of the country, which are really quite severe. The ban on mixing with anybody from another household in your own home or garden, stopping normal family contact, stopping people meeting friends. And this has been in place, certainly in the case of my constituency, since the 28th of July, with the exception of one 12-hour period when we were taken out of the restrictions and then put back in.
Right.
So I think people can accept quite a lot and were prepared to make sacrifices as long as they could see that the end was in sight. As it starts to look like this might come in cycles, and the suggestion from some people that you could have another hard lockdown, I think people lose patience.
Do you think there's a hope of getting enough support to make a difference?
I'm very hopeful that the government will accept the case that I've been putting. I know many members of the government themselves have felt quite uneasy about the extent to which government has acted without parliamentary approval. And I very much hope that we can come to a sensible accommodation where, for the big national policy interventions, there is an understanding that they will necessarily be debated and voted on by Parliament before they can come into effect.
Are you disappointed in the path that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has taken in terms of the ultra caution, but also the failure to involve his party in the decision?
Well, I think we all understand this has been a difficult, challenging period. It would have been challenging for any government. But I do think as well, all governments are prone to bad habits. And the habit of getting away without scrutiny, not being held accountable, is very attractive for governments. So it's not entirely surprising that having started off legislating by decree in the coronavirus measures back in March and through April, May and June, that ministers have got into the habit of doing that. But it isn't acceptable. It isn't the way we are used to being governed, and it's not appropriate in a free country or a parliamentary democracy like the United Kingdom. I think, in a way, the more surprising thing is that it took me to have to stand up and say that. One might have hoped that Her Majesty's loyal opposition would at some point have complained that these things were being put through without proper parliamentary approval and scrutiny. But I hope they will now recognise the error of their ways.
Do you think, it seems extraordinary that it was just December that the new Conservative government was elected, this big majority, everyone was celebrating, your committee was happy, and now, just 6 months later, you've had to start appearing on the airwaves criticising your Prime Minister. How did it change so rapidly?
Well, these are extraordinary times, and they've been extraordinary challenges for government. But I do think that these responses would be better the more they were debated, the more the arguments are drawn out in Parliament. I think, very classic example, the rule of 6. Had we had those debates and expected votes to approve or not approve, I think we would have had a far more cogent explanation, at the very least, of why ministers were pressing for a rule of 6 rather than a rule of 8, why they wanted to include young children in the 6, whereas the Scots, in my view, came to a more sensible position of excluding young children to help to accommodate more families and make life easier for them. So all those things are drawn out in parliamentary debate, and most importantly of all, I think the opportunity to draw out the criteria, both the reasons why the measures being taken, but the criteria for success or failure, and when, therefore, ministers would come to the conclusion either they'd worked and could be withdrawn, or indeed that they were not working and could be brought to an end as well.
So would you support, for example, an amendment that said all measures must have the rationale published for their expiry?
I think that, I'm not sure that's something you do by amendment. I think it's something that in any debate leading to a vote on particular restrictions, I think it should be right at the top of the list in Parliament to say, until when? What do you expect to have been achieved by this in order for this to become unnecessary? And it hasn't been done in relation to face masks, where they publish no criteria whatsoever, either for the introduction of them or for when the compulsion to wear them in shops and public transport would be withdrawn.
So you reject this sort of talk of a new normal, that people should just be getting used to these kind of habits?
I think I would expect government, if it's going to introduce legal compulsion on people, I would expect government at the very least to set out in detail the reasons, the evidence that underpins it, and the criteria that would be used to judge when is the right time to withdraw that compulsion.
Okay, final question. So, as I understand it, what you're saying is you're going to be successful, you hope, without having this needing to go to a vote at all. That you think the government will proactively suggest some level of required parliamentary vote?
I've been in discussions with the Chief Whip. I hope that we're going to reach an accommodation. I think there is a recognition. Indeed, the Health Secretary just answered my question in the statement in the House this afternoon. There is a growing recognition that there needs to be more scrutiny, more parliamentary involvement. So I very much hope that we will reach the point where it is a part of the government's motion that provides for that scrutiny and parliamentary approval by votes, and that I don't have to push my amendment and ask my colleagues to join me in a division against the government.
Is there any sense in which your actual business of parliamentary politics is made impossible or harder by the restrictions, even within Parliament? Because you can't gather and gossip and plot in the coffee shops. How can you be an effective parliamentarian with these kind of restrictions?
It is much, much harder, and the House of Commons is still, for reasons that elude me, adhering to the old 2 metre social distancing rule, not even the 1 metre plus that the rest of the country has been asked to observe for several months now. So that leads to the chamber being very sparsely populated, very few seats available in there. For instance, when the statement happened this afternoon, I had a question, but I couldn't be in the chamber to hear the statement, which seems frankly bizarre. And then the normal social interactions with one chair at each table in Portcullis House and a couple of chairs at the big tables in the tea room, it just makes it much harder to keep in touch, much harder to keep on top of what is going on. I very much hope that we move on quickly because it is holding back parliamentary scrutiny, and that is bad for the country.
If there was a vote on a full second national lockdown tomorrow, would you vote for it? And do you think your colleagues would support it enough for it to pass?
I would vote against a full national lockdown. I think the first lockdown was reasonable because of the concern at the time that NHS critical care capacity could be overwhelmed. I don't think lockdowns get rid of COVID-19. All they can do is defer the moment when the infection spreads. Would the vote be won? I suspect the government, if it wanted to do that, I hope it won't, but if the government wanted a full national lockdown, I suspect it would win the vote. But it would do so with a very large number of votes from the Labour side of the House, because one of the strange things about this crisis has been the extent to which the opposition parties, the Labour Party in particular, has been keen to see as much restriction for as long as possible, even though it's going to cause significant unemployment and harm for so many people.
If there was some technical reason why the Labour Party did not want to support it, they had additional conditions or whatever, do you think there'd be enough Tory votes to pass a national lockdown?
I think there would be a very significant number of Conservative members of Parliament who would vote against a full national lockdown. And I have to say the responses that I've had from members of the public, and in particular my own constituents over the last few weeks, particularly in debating the local restrictions in Trafford, overwhelmingly I think people are in a mood where they want to be treated as adults. They're prepared to take the virus seriously, but they expect to be able to use their common sense and judgment. They don't expect to have their lives micromanaged by government.
Enough votes to defeat the government in that scenario?
It all depends when it came, but I think the longer we go on, the more sceptical people are becoming about the value of full national lockdowns.
Graham Brady, thank you so much.
Thank you.